All right, so let's get going. We have a lot to cover today. Okay, so I'm just going to start with a very brief review over educational decisions. We have instructional decisions, which are very simple ones where you're going back to review things when you're spending time on addition with regrouping. You found that there was some sort of lapse in the original teaching that you did, so you make the instructional decision to spend more time on something. We have a lot of grading decisions that we go about on our daily lives. We do a lot of them in advance, so a lot of things are laid out in the syllabus. There's a lot of thought that goes into those documents, which are almost like a contract with attendance, behavior, and effort. We define what we are and are not going to be grading, and so that again is a decision. We have a lot of diagnostic decisions. Diagnostic decisions are the ones where we're really trying to get in about and understand the student's strengths and their weaknesses. So identifying a student's strengths can be really helpful because then you compare them with maybe a student who has a weakness in a particular issue. Similarly, identifying a weakness is also very good. You definitely need to be doing that while you're teaching. So then we have the selection decisions and the placement decisions and the counseling decisions, and those are all a lot of the using test scores and also teacher feedback to make some sort of placement or allow someone into a group, and that's kind of following the theme again on program and administration decisions. Where we're looking at the promotion and graduation of the students. All right, so when we talk about testing versus assessment, we're saying, hey, testing, you're a very formal sort of procedure. If I tell you that we're taking a test, you can envision something that's going to be actually occurring. Whereas with an assessment, not everyone has a very formalized idea of what an assessment is, because it doesn't have to end with a grade, and frequently it doesn't. Assessments can come and go at any time, and as your textbook author very much so says, it is a process. So assessment does not end with giving someone a document to get the knowledge that they have about a topic on paper. Well, we go past that, we grade it, then we look at the grades and say, oh, more than 80% of my students bombed this. I need to spend more time. They clearly didn't get it. So that's part of the assessment process. All right, and so we have these sort of summative and formative assessments, and we're going to be talking today in depth about formative assessment, but as sort of an overview here, we have summative assessments that's, the end of something. You got to the very end of something and we said, well, what did you learn? Show me what you know, sort of idea. The formative assessment, however, that's happening far more frequently. So by that, let me just go ahead and say summative, not happening every day. They are, it takes time to get to a point where you have enough content to be summative about. Formative, well, I'm forming an opinion and I'm forming your knowledge every single day. I can give those far more frequently. And this can be small, it can be large, they can be at any time of the day, they can be on the fly. Good formative assessment, though, is planned out in advance, so they're generally not on the fly. But there can be times when you're looking at your students and they're giving you that lost look, and you know what I'm talking about. But they give that to you and you think, okay, let me confirm what they do know and what they don't know. Let's do this right now and see what I need to spend more time on. Okay, so here we go, formative assessment. If you'll remember from last week, SWABOT, students will be able to. You will be able to define formative and summative assessment. You will be able to illustrate examples within the learning process. Okay, so we have these two ideas. I already covered this a little bit, but again, it is day-to-day decision making that we are caring about here. All right, so as part of the review, just to remind yourself that we are generally looking at educational testing for summative and formative assessment. And unfortunately, summative assessments are most commonly thought of as teaching and learning. Most parents, administration, people, and especially our legal friends who give us our teaching choices, they are not thinking of formative assessment as a rule being the end-all and be-all of assessment and learning. They're thinking that there is some sort of summative test that proves student can go on, or that they need more instructions and need to be retained in the grade. So summative is generally a very, very important test, but they are not generally used all that often. Okay, more of that. So we have our cook friend here. So when you're doing it along the way, it's formative, but when you have the final thing and you're testing the final thing, As I was updating the slides for this semester, the idea that there are multiple viewpoints about what formative assessment is became very, even more noticeable to me, which should be surprising, right? Because I do know quite a bit about classroom assessment, but formative assessment pops up all over the place. So we're going to be talking about Common Core and Florida State Standards, and it's amazing how formative assessment is there, and it's viewed as something completely different no matter what I'm looking at. So it's a very varied thing, even though the tenets and nuances of formative assessment remain the same. Okay, so our Council of Chief State School Officers, who are the folks that give us Common Core, they are talking about how formative assessment is a process, and that's definitely in line with your current textbook, Macmillan. His idea is that it is also a process. So it's this cyclical thing that's going on between teachers and students, where you're providing feedback to students. Students are providing feedback to you. Technically, that's what a test is. It's a form of feedback. And then you are to use that to improve your instruction, and then the cycle repeats. All right, so this is our formative and summative assessment sort of differences, what they are and what they aren't. I don't need to go over that. We're going to be talking about each section in depth shortly. All right, so why are we using these? If a summative is larger and it's not sensitive to small specific changes in learning and can't evaluate, the effectiveness of instruction on a day-to-day basis, well, what can? The what can is formative. Formative assessments are far more useful for our everyday sort of understanding because we're monitoring students' progress. And that becomes really important because as we start talking about RTI and IEPs and 504 plans, the monitoring of student progress is a very key hallmark of these plans that we absolutely have to do to be effective teachers. Okay, so formative assessments are really good because they're synonymous and they flow in instruction very well. And then they allow for repeated assessment without it having to be burdensome. I would say it's a good idea of how to think about this. And it's very easy then to identify the students who are not responding well to instruction, because there will be students who do understand. For whatever reason, they just got it more so than some other student, and you need to spend more time with students, of course, that didn't understand, which then, of course, allows you to adjust to the student's needs. And overall, the theme here is that you're making these daily instructional decisions with the goal, of course, to maximize student learning. All right, so when we talk about these things, they're flexible. They should allow students to recall prior knowledge because formative assessment is not a quiz always. It's not even, it can just be a series of questions. Susie, can you explain to me how you got to this answer? Can you sound this out for me? Raul, can you explain to me how you got here? That's not a quiz. It's not a grade associated with this formative assessment, but it is going to tell me their process and thinking. So again, this critical thinking, as we get a little later into the lecture, you're going to see that critical thinking theme return again, because critical thinking is something that we're very much so moving toward with the Common Core. All right, so again, it's supposed to increase class participation, but formative assessment doesn't have to be class-wide. It can just be an individual on their own. Okay, so we have more information about formative assessment, about sharing information, in which case it's good here because it helps open a line of communication where perhaps a summative assessment would not cover as much of the issue you're dealing with at one point. So let me give you an example, because that makes things a little more concrete for me. So at a summative assessment, you might have at the end of a unit, 2 questions devoted to some sort of standard you're covering. And in formative assessment, I could have as many questions as I want. So I could have, 6 or 4 questions on the same topic, so I know every single section that you have mastered a skill at every single level of it. Whereas at a summative assessment, if I only have those 2 questions, then I don't know where exactly you went wrong. I just know that you're some combination of these skills went wrong for you, and I can't really tell and pinpoint what exactly is wrong. And so formative will let me do that. Will let me drill down to knowing exactly what it is that's wrong. And if you're asking sort of the thought-provoking questions about having students explain the rules for sounding out words that are difficult words or something like that, it can increase a sense of ownership in learning. Okay, so this is a nice little table that I've made. So we've got what it is and what it's not. And it's planned. It is based on assessment evidence. It is using this information to change your teaching. And it's, this is a field term, actionable feedback for students. Whereas, I could grade an essay and just have sort of comments for you, and nothing happens with those comments. And I'm guilty of that too, having feedback and not doing anything with it. Our formative assessment comments and feedback to students are generally in the moment. Let me help you understand this, make changes immediately, and very actionable for students. Okay, and generally there isn't grading associated with formative assessment, and you don't move on if there's generally a problem. You stop and correct it then. All right, this is a lot of text on the slide, I know. But in general, what it's coming out and telling you is that formative assessment should be used because it improves learning outcomes for almost everybody. It is very hard to find a student where formative assessment does not actually help them. And then to add to that, we have federal law that's saying that we really need to narrow learning gaps. And hey, there's this fun tools teachers have called formative assessment that lets them do this, so they should be doing it. So that's really the essence of all this text on the slide. But it is worth mentioning, and if you want to go see these papers, they are good reads. Okay, so what does this look like? Because, okay, you're doing all this, but what does it actually look like in practice? All right, so we have sort of a whole list of things. You've got discussion. Discussion's a great way to tell if a student or students understand it. And now, there's a time and place for each one of these. A discussion does not always make sense or work for a topic. But if you're trying to get out a discussion on, do we understand the choices people were making in the Revolutionary War or something, then yeah, that's perfectly fine. I don't need some sort of a directed question. I can ask directed questions for that, sure. Doesn't really make sense for observations, maybe not. So something like that is better suited for discussion. Whereas, quiz, maybe a quiz is appropriate. If you have a math issue and you want to see if you can move on to the next component of the math thing, it's probably a lot easier to do it with a quiz than it is a discussion. Okay. So the teacher-made formative assessments provide information about student learning. So let's drill that in, because that is very important. And these are, really short. They're going to be going on all the time. You may, in a single week, do hundreds of formative assessments. And they aren't, always so formal. They're just a quick check with a student, maybe, or a group of students, or classroom students, that you are just, do you understand this? Or a formative assessment can even be as simple as going over and looking over student and not saying anything. You're observing. You never said anything. You just saw them do it, and that's still considered formative assessment, because you're making an assessment of their learning. So you can see why those can rack up in a school week. All right, so when we're doing this, they're generally pretty short, and it's supposed to increase student and teacher efficacy, because it's helping the students know that they understood it. So they're not getting to the test and saying, I didn't realize until the test that I didn't know something, because that's not so good. And likewise, it helps teachers know that, hey, this new activity I used this semester, it worked. It worked really well. Or, oh, this did not work. Let's not use this again. All right, so how does this differ from other types of assessment? Because there's no one-size-fits-all thing when it comes to formative assessment. The type of assessment you should be using is really based on your learning goals, and that's going to be a theme that we circle back around to as we create our test plan development activity that we have. So as you start creating your tests, that's going to be a distinct theme that you'll need to remember, that we have goals, and tests are only supposed to reflect those goals. What was I trying to get out of you when I made this test is sort of where that thought pattern's going to. And it should be the same thing for formative assessment. Even though these may never be, paper pencil tests, the thoughts, the recognition that you should need to stop and ask and build time into your day to be doing this, it needs to be planned in advance. All right, so there's a whole list here. That's formal observations and all this sort of stuff. And there's a source link here too as well, to a PDF about this stuff. That's from the Department of Education in Florida, telling teachers exactly what they believe formative assessment should be. Okay, so that was a lot, right? So I have this table here to try and sort of tease apart the differences between formative, benchmarks, and summative assessments. And so this can be really helpful, and I'll just, I think I'm going to start not at the top, which is a little strange, but I'm going to talk to you about scope for a second. So scope really is indicating here that the formative assessments are really small. Benchmarks are going to be school-wide or grade-wide, and summative is large-scale. And I think that that's a really good place to think about starting for a second, because that's, I think, a good way to understand that you have more control over a formative assessment than you do over a benchmark or a summative. If something's school or grade-wide, you don't have much control over that. You have control over your classroom, and that's about it. So I think that that's a really good distinctive point to be making here. The purpose of formative, of course, is to diagnose where there's learning gaps and adjust your instruction. In benchmarking, you're trying to really understand and tracking student performance. And then in summative, that you're trying to to sort of gauge mastery of content. Okay, and then I don't really want to go through the whole chart, but you are welcome to come back to this, of course. The frequency is important because formative is daily. Benchmark feels frequent, let me just say that, but it's actually, predetermined intervals of time. And summative is, generally at a prescribed time of the year. Like we have our FSA testing, we always know what's going to happen. That sort of idea. Okay, so we have tiers of assessment, and this sort of is getting to that as well, where we say summative. Summative is at the tippy top because you have summed the mountain of coursework and you're going to test on it now, right? So insofar as duration, summative is not that frequent. That is not happening every day. Your evaluative, predictive, interim, sort of benchmarky things are middle grade. And formative assessment is, they have it saying is minute by minute, but that's kind of an exaggeration. But it is generally integrated into your lesson, and that is far more frequent. And that's in the, going on the axis here, going from frequency of administration, that's happening far more frequently. All right, so when we talk about types of these things, we generally say, hey, there's a lot of things you could be doing. This is what I'm going to be talking about next are some examples, but they're not, the end-all and be-all that formative assessment can be. Right, but generally, when you're doing this, it's generally you're supposed to be asking the question to yourself, at least, what is the purpose for the formative assessment? Well, what are you doing? What are you trying to get out of it? And generally, that helps inform the sort of things you do to get the formative assessment, like to pick a type of formative assessment. So we have examples. We've got minute papers, chain notes, directed paraphrasing, sentence summaries, reading and chunking. All right, so the minute papers, because I recognize that not everyone, at least in my past classes, not everyone has known what all these things are, so I'm going to go over them a little briefly. So the minute paper is you're trying to very succinctly determine what a student has learned. What were 3 important things about today's lesson? You just review responses and note any useful comments, sort of things. All right, chain notes. You have to write some sort of meaningful question on the front of the envelope, and you have to have the students place their responses in the envelope. If you have a larger class, you're generally using 2 envelopes for this, but you're supposed to be able to see a pattern of response in the notes that come through. All right, so directed paraphrasing. I had a biology teacher that loved this. This is where you're supposed to be writing a layman's translation of something. I gotta tell you that trying to write a layman's translation of mitosis did not go well for me. So just be aware that this does not work for everything. But on the formative assessment aspect of this, you're saying, does the student's understanding match what I know to be correct? And then you're supposed to be categorizing the students into maybe groups where they might need and helpful instruction. Or if you have like 3 succinct groups, you could have some of your stronger learners and some of your weaker learners pair up. Okay. All right, so the 1-sentence summary, it's sort of an exity thing generally. You're supposed to condense information into a single sentence, right? Good luck with that. To say if the big ticket theme of this whole day's lesson was what. I find that these are maybe more common in the sort of English units where we talk maybe about themes and stuff, and maybe some history, but it's hard to do that in math. All right, so application cards. This is very useful. where you have to write a real-world application. And that's surprisingly in line with where Common Core is about having real-world application be added to the curriculum. So this is definitely a good one. Student-generated test questions are sometimes good. Sometimes their test questions aren't so great. So they're supposed to sort of be thinking in advance, and you should all be doing this as a sort of a skill-based thing using. Here's a hint. Please use our students will be able to objectives, and you will be able to sort of think about where our testing will be for your exam. But students developing that when they may not always have a clear idea about what the teacher's objectives are for them, this is a good exercise for them to really sort of analyze what in the world they think you were trying to get across to them. So that it's kind of deep, but it's an interesting sort of activity for them to do. All right. So I am going to put a disclaimer on this section. I am very well aware that the Common Core has some happy people that love it, and there's some people that really hate the Common Core, and then there's people that just are frustrated by it, and or how it's being implemented. That might be more to a truth of the matter. So I'm just going to give a tiny overview about this giant subject. All right, so this whole thing started in 2009, and the writer of the Common Core started writing the whole bit from 12th grade down to kindergarten. So they worked their way backwards through the curriculum, and they said, this is what at each level students really should be able to do or know. This is what we should be having. And the idea here is that you should have consistent standards across the states. So I'm going to pick on 2 states for a minute. We're going to start with Massachusetts. Massachusetts had a really good standard level education period. Like before this ever started, they were good. Whereas like Tennessee did not. And I don't mean to pick on your state if you're from Tennessee, but their educational standards, what they were expecting out of students at every grade level, was not as rigorous as some of the other states. And so if you moved from Massachusetts to Tennessee or from Tennessee to Massachusetts, you encountered a very distinctly different set of educational standards. And so being that people are not, geographically bound, we needed to start getting people into the same sort of level of education from state to state. And also, big move is that it sort of is designed to ensure that if you're graduating from high school, you're actually prepared to enter college and or the workforce, and that sort of at the time aligned with the Race to the Top and the NCLB stuff. All right, so it is written from kindergarten to 12th grade. It is for English language arts and the math standards, and it started in 2009, and people get a little confused sometimes, but it is not mandated. The states adopt this if they want to, right? So this is not anything that the government is telling you that you have to do. It got a little confusing because I believe if you were in Common Core, you got like 40 extra points on some measure they have to report to, but I can't remember the name of it at the moment. But in general, there is no federal requirement for you to be in Common Core. So that being said, there are 44 of the 50 states that have some elements adopted of either ELA or the math standards of Common Core. Of the U.S. territories, only Puerto Rico has not adopted the U.S. territories, has not adopted the curriculum. So the Florida standards are, Florida's response to Common Core. So they adopted Common Core in 2014, and then they made standards for it. And that's where people start being a little contentious about this, because prior to this, consistent education across the states, yeah, that makes sense. Preparing students for college, yes, that makes sense. How we go about doing that, though, is where people start getting a little contentious. So Florida created their Florida standards as an interpretation of how what standards should be to accomplish Common Core. And since they adopted it, they've attempted twice to pause implementation, and that didn't work out. So as far as I know, we are continuing with Common Core and the Florida State Standards now that we have them in place. All right, so in general, these standards are designed to emphasize complexity and critical thinking and skills like collaboration and reasoning. So again, this is what Common Core is meant to do. So you can see that that's not a big deal. That makes perfect sense. Those are real world skills, critical thinking, collaboration, reasoning. I can totally see how that's useful in the workforce and in everyday life. So, our debates don't come from that. There is a distinct shift in the Common Core ideology that we're going from teacher-centered, where we test and hope for the best sort of idea, to a student-centered student-centered education is where we're going to. And then we have this sort of spiral of skills and concepts being reinforced. So if you'll remember, I told you that they worked backwards, right? So they worked from grade 12 and went all the way down to kindergarten. And they have, a whole sort of mansion. If you think of a mansion, how you have a foundation and you've got the rebar in it and you've got different walls and structures and supports. Well, the Common Core is built the same way, in that everything is laid up on top of each other and they reinforce each other throughout all the different grade levels. So if you missed some integral skill at grade 2, it's going to affect you throughout all of your grades, which isn't too surprising. So let's stop for a minute and say that you somehow missed out on understanding multiplication, right? That's going to be a big issue, and it's not going to go away as you go on in your math, right? It's not just going to suddenly stop mattering. So that's the idea that they're trying to get at with Common Core. All right, so when we relate Common Core to formative assessment, we say that there are a few questions that we're going to be answering. The ones that are really far more related to assessment are, if my students have trouble learning the material, how do I tell? Or how do I know if my students already know this? Well, you can't really do or know that unless you have formative assessment. Because remember, if you're using differentiated instruction, or if you're understanding, what skills your students do or do not have, you're using some sort of assessment to figure that out. So the data required sections are kind of where formative assessment is picking up those gaps. All right, so the objective, and I kind of mentioned this already, is that you're trying to provide feedback and adjust your instruction. So it's no longer teacher to student or student to teacher. It is a cyclical cycle that, the teacher is providing feedback to the student is doing something to provide feedback to the teacher, and it just continues over and over again. Okay, so Florida has its own formative assessment systems. These came online last year in 2015, and ours are called the English Language Arts Formative Assessment System and the Math Formative Assessment System. So English Language Arts is K through 8. The math is K through 8, Algebra 1, and Geometry. All right, so the systems are free. They have a lot of tasks that help students try to break down and understand exactly where it is that they might be having problems. So if you remember earlier, I talked about summative assessment and formative assessment, the difference between knowing that you got something wrong, summative, versus formative. I can tell exactly where you got it wrong. That is really what these systems are designed to do. Let me test the student. Let me give them a single problem. And then, okay, if they got that right, then okay, keep going. If they didn't get it wrong, let me test every section individually of what that question was designed to test. Let me test every skill associated with that question and see exactly what's wrong. And that's really helpful to teachers because it helps them diagnose and then make instructional and educational decisions for their students. So I have an example of these. This is coming out of grade 5, where we're looking at multisyllabic words. So if a student is struggling to read these, some of the misconceptions, so the Pearson system will tell you, hey, it's very likely that students will miscue the words like atmosphere and telescope. And what you should be asking, you should be saying to your students, you did a great job reading this difficult word, the word payload, right? How did you attack that word when you first saw it? And so then the instructional implication might be, if they don't have a good response, that you need to review steps for how to tackle unfamiliar words, right? So another example. If the student doesn't use the strategies to read unfamiliar words, of which there's a long list of strategies, you should be asking, what parts of the word did you recognize, right? And then potentially need to review the syllabication rules with them. All right, so the system is also really nice because it also includes examples for ELL learning. So it reminds teachers that ELLs may struggle with words because their first language's rules may interfere with what they're trying to learn now. So, for example, in Spanish, some of the issues with English are the vowels. There's the consonant clusters, so you might see something like express for express. And so you might be asking the students then to tell you how to separate the sounds of this word by clapping or tapping your pencil or pointing when you believe there is a syllable. So the sort of implication here is that as an instructor, you're going to be then researching the concept of the root word and then having the students read these things aloud to try and really help them. So for an example, you might have this: when astronauts go into space, they can float because they're weightless. What do you think less means? What does that mean? And then you might drill down and say, well, weight is heaviness and less is fewer, so we can get to the understanding of what it is. This system is also really helpful because it goes into a lot of different languages. So there's Spanish, there's Chinese, there's Russian, there's Korean, and there's something else that I can't remember at the moment, and they're continuing to add to it. So it's a very useful system that you'll probably be experiencing if you're in these grades.